Let's talk about the weird history of Final Fantasy XIV's monk job. In this video, we'll be looking broadly at the toolkit of the monk, all the way back from A Realm Reborn, and then explore how this evolved and changed as we make our way through every expansion, all the way to Endwalker. To start, it is worth noting that in A Realm Reborn, there were 4 core mechanics that worked slightly to significantly differently to today. The first one is that limit breaks were simpler and just did a fixed potency of damage if they were attacks. This is not particularly important for monks however, as all melee DPS jobs actually used Monk's final Heaven limit break as their limit break 3. In Endwalker, the formula is more complex because the power of the attack is related to a combination of the entire party's stats. The second mechanic is the party bonus. These days, there is a direct incentive to bring at least one of every role because each unique role represented grants the raid a blanket 1% bonus in all attributes. Before Shadowbringers, however, this worked differently. Instead, each role represented a specific attribute and granted a 3% bonus to that attribute for being present. This meant, for example, that having a healer present would boost everyone's mind by 3%. Not particularly helpful for a monk, for example, as you would have access to nothing that used mind. On the other hand, jobs like Bard and Paladin did have access to simple healing spells like Cure or Physic through the cross-class system, so for them this wouldn't be completely pointless. Monks and Dragoons would specifically grant the entire raid a plus 3% bonus to Strength, which was helpful for every job except Bard and Ninja, given that all other jobs than Nis would, if nothing else, at least get a stronger auto attack from it. Yes, mage auto attacks mattered even back then, unless perhaps you were a black mage. This meant that while bringing a job like a Bard might be helpful for its unique utility it brought, it was crucial to bring at least one strength job in your parties for the strength party bonus. The third core mechanic is TP. Before Shadowbringers, all jobs had a TP bar in addition to the MP bar. TP capped at 1000 and recovered by 60 every 3 seconds while in combat and by 100 every 3 seconds while not in combat. Most single target weapon skills would cost somewhere between 40 and 70 TP, with some outliers costing more due to utility bonuses. While area of effect, AoE for short, weapon skills would cost around 110 to 130 typically. This meant that even performing your regular single target rotation would eventually tire you out. This is slightly more important for monks due to their faster GCDs compared to all other jobs. In addition to this, Sprint used to cost all of your TP to use at all, so most physical jobs had a very awkward relationship with this action. This was not changed until Stormblood. The fourth core mechanic is related to weaving. Back in the day, weapon skills and abilities had a lot more animation lock than they have today. Given that this subject is not very clearly documented like a tooltip, this is mostly based on personal accounts, but the general consensus is that most jobs could not double weave, let alone single weave without risking clipping the GCD. Furthermore, most jobs had a weirdly enormous amount of buffs they could apply due to a combination of the buffs they had access to personally and the cross-class feature, which I will get back to a bit later. Now, with some of our general weirdness covered, let's take it from the top, and what I mean by that is let's look at how Monk worked in A Realm Reborn and see how it changed on its journey to Endwalker. In A Realm Reborn, the Monk's single target combos were mostly already put in place, however, some of them worked differently. For example, all of them had positional bonuses. Bootshine's guaranteed critical hit property from Oppo form only activated if used from behind the target. True Strike also had a 5% bonus critical hit chance if used from behind the target. Twin Snakes and Dragon Kick instead did extra damage from the side. Your forms only lasted 10 seconds instead of today's 30, so you actually had to get a move on at times, which was further emphasized by the fact that monks had several GCD actions that were unrelated to the form changing. In addition to this, Greased Lightning, the trait that reduces GCD times for monks, was instead a stacking buff that increased your damage done and reduced the GCD. Every time you did a combo finisher like Snap Punch or Demolish, you gained 1 stack of Greased Lightning and refreshed the buff, which lasted a generous 12 seconds back then. So a short amount of downtime could drop you back down to 0, so you had to start again. Dragon Kick also worked differently, instead applying a blunt resistance down debuff that made enemies take more damage from blunt weapons such as fists, feet, and wands and books. Dragon Kick also reduced the target's intelligence, which reduced magic damage done. Twin Snake's buff also only lasted 12 seconds, so you needed to get up in speed before it was reasonably feasible to even keep the buff up 100% of the time. For the third combo set, Arm of the Destroyer did far less damage than it does today, and also cost a hefty 130 TP per use, which Demolish also did. However, Arm of the Destroyer also applied a 1 second silence as its form bonus, which meant it was essentially an AoE interrupt. Rockbreaker is unchanged from today's version, aside from being a frontal cone attack. For the Raptor form step, monks did not have any AoE option, and instead had one Ilm Punch, which simply removed a buff from the target. I am not sure if this had any use in dungeons or raids. For buffs, the monk had Internal Release, which boosted their critical hit chance by 30% with up to 25% uptime. They also had Featherfoot, which increased their evasion by 25%. They also had Mantra, which surprisingly was more powerful back then than it is today. And of course, Perfect Balance, which for 10 seconds allowed you to use actions that required a specific form, just like it does today. Given how much closer in power these actions were to each other back then, I think what you wanted to use in Perfect Balance was a lot more complicated. Unless it was in the opener, in which case it probably included Demolish and 2 Snap Punches for that Greased Lightning. Finally, monks also had access to Fists of Earth, Wind and Fire, which reduced damage taken by 10%, increased your movement speed by 10%, or increased damage done by 5%. You could only use one at a time, so generally you wanted to use Fists of Fire in most situations. For other attacks, Steel Peak and Howling Fist served as OGCD attacks, where Steel Peak also delivered a 4-second stun. You also got Shoulder Tackle, which was a 2-second stun and moved you to your target, a bit like how Thunderclap does today. Shoulder Tackle also cost TP and had a really long cooldown, probably to prevent it from being used just for its damage. For GCD options, Touch of Death was, due to its damage over time, dot for short, potency, actually your strongest attack, doing more damage than even Demolish. Haymaker was an attack that applied an attack speed slow akin to arm's length, but it was only available after dodging, synergizing well with the Featherfoot buff. And then there were the cross-class actions. In A Realm Reborn, cross-class actions were a handful of options you could unlock by leveling other classes up to use on your current job. By level 50, you would be allowed to pick up to 5 amongst a set list of actions. For example, even if Bard's Raging Strikes sound incredibly neat for a monk, monks simply weren't offered it. As classes stopped learning new actions after level 50, Heavensward would not really add anything to these lists, and the system was entirely replaced in Stormblood. Amongst the monks' picks, the best ones were Lancer's Blood for Blood, increasing damage done, and Taken, Marauder's Fracture, an extra dot that was powerful enough to at least consider. Mercy Stroke, an execution-style attack from Marauder that meant more damage when the boss was nearing its end. And Invigorate from Lancer, which allowed you to generate some extra TP every now and then. This left one free slot for you to pick amongst all the defensive options. Speaking of defensive options, the Monk's Second Wind healed for a fixed 15% of their own HP. Before moving on, I just want to highlight that you could actually pick the step 2 of the Marauder's Enmity combo, but not the step 1. You could also pick a step 1 combo from Lancer, and given the potency it had from behind, I wonder if it might have actually been viable. Aside from differences in what buffs were applied and what OGCDs were available, the Monk of A Realm Reborn actually played shockingly similarly to how it does in Endwalker, with the key differences being in Mercy Stroke, Touch of Death, and how Perfect Balance was used. Something worth mentioning is that Monk did not have any enmity management tools in their toolkit, which I suspect may have been able to cause some issues back in A Realm Reborn. With the release of Heavensward, a bunch of things changed slightly for the Monk. Greased Lightning now granted 10% more damage per stack and lasted 14 seconds. Twin Snakes now also lasted 15 seconds, and True Strike's positional bonus was changed to a potency gain. Demolish was also granted an upfront damage value. Did you notice? In A Realm Reborn, Demolish actually didn't do any damage, but just applied the dot. Shoulder Tackle's cooldown was also cut down to just 30 seconds. With Heavensward, 6 new actions were added. Form Shift allowed you to flip through each form to be able to start combat in your form of choice. Take note, however, that you had to explicitly use a combo finisher to grant Greased Lightning or extend it, and you needed to use Form Shift 3 times to reach Curl form to do so. Meditation granted 1 chakra each time it was used and had a GCD of 1.2 seconds, and it did not grant more than 1 if you were not in combat. When at 5 stacks, you could use Forbidden Chakra as an OGCD. Elixir Field was added as an extra OGCD attack to work alongside Howling Fist and Steel Peak. Purification was a long cooldown that could be used to spend your chakras to restore TP instead of Forbidden Chakra. And Tornado Kick was introduced as a finishing move that hit quite hard for a monk action. Why was it a finishing move? Because it was only usable while at 3 Greased Lightning stacks, and it would consume all of the Greased Lightning stacks upon use. Essentially, Tornado Kick functioned as a much more brutal combo finisher than how 6-sided Star works today. As far as monk players were concerned, the main benefits were that meditation and form shift allowed the monks to at least do something when they were forced out of range or when nothing was available to attack. And with great skill, Tornado Kick could turn your Greased Lightning stacks into something instead of just dropping off in downtime. Elixir Field being your shortest OGCD attack and also your strongest was also somewhat funny in retrospect. Which leads us to Stormblood. Right off the bat, this causes changes for the monk in that the cross-class feature is removed and is replaced with the roll actions feature. This meant the loss of Fracture, Mercy Stroke and Blood for Blood. In their place, 10 roll actions were offered, where you could pick up to 5. Amongst them were Second Wind, Arm's Length, Leg Sweep, Bloodbath, Feint and True North, which all functioned at least similarly to how they do today. Invigorate was also placed here. On top of that, Diversion cut your enmity generation for 15 seconds, Crutch allowed you to remove someone else's binds and heavy, and Goad allowed you to significantly boost the TP recovery of someone else. Which weirdly meant that a lot of players simply didn't bother because it didn't help themselves, speaking from personal experience here. Sprint also lost its TP cost completely. For the monk's own actions, Steel Peak lost its 4-second stun effect. One Ilm Punch now applies a 1-second stun, which is unaffected by diminishing returns. And Dragon Kick lost its intelligence reduction. Perfect Balance's cooldown was also increased to 3 minutes for some reason. In addition to this, the following actions were also removed completely: Featherfoot, Haymaker, and Touch of Death. With Stormblood, a bunch of new actions were of course also added. Whenever you dealt critical damage with a weapon skill, Deep Meditation had a 50% chance to grant you a chakra, similar to how Deep Meditation works today, just much less likely. Riddle of Earth was a defensive cooldown that forced you into Fists of Earth on use, but also as a bonus refreshed the duration of Greased Lightning on use, which now also lasted 16 seconds. So it could be used in an emergency to briefly extend it once. Tackle Mastery changed Shoulder Tackle into a different action depending on what fists you have active. Earth Tackle had a shorter range and knocked the enemy back on use. Fire Tackle did slightly more damage, and Wind Tackle could be used twice, with the second use appearing as Riddle of Wind. Wind Tackle's 2 hits did the same damage as Fire Tackle. Riddle of Fire increased your damage by a whopping 30%, but also increased your recast times by 15%, effectively negating the speed increases from Greased Lightning for the duration. It also forced you into Fists of Fire, although I'm not sure if anyone actually cared about that aspect. Finally, Brotherhood increased the raid's physical damage by 5% and gave the monk a 30% chance to get a chakra stack whenever someone affected executed a weapon skill. It is worth pointing out that the tooltip suggested the monk itself was not given this buff. This also meant that monks had better synergy with group compositions with a more physical leaning lineup. At most 1 mage and 2 healers, no Dark Knights. The biggest impact these changes had on the monk's rotation was that chakra could now be generated without using meditation directly, and Riddle of Fire caused a weird slowdown in their rotation while bursting. Monks' big cooldowns lining up every 90 seconds was significant for the rest of the raid at times for synergy reasons. Already by this point, the main thing monks were missing was just a way to extend Greased Lightning more reliably in downtimes, and a full 1-2-3 AoE combo option. Although, with the TP limitations, this was not that important at the end of the day. However, with Shadowbringers, a bunch of changes came, one of which was the complete removal of the TP bar in its entirety, opening the gates for endlessly spammable AoE attacks. One Ilm Punch was replaced by 4-point Fury, which had the effect that it could extend the buff from Twin Snakes, should it be present when the attack was used, allowing monks to do a clean 1-2-3 AoE combo. Armor the Destroyer also lost its silencing component and instead did way more respectable damage, especially from Oppo Oppo form. The role action True North was also changed to the 2 charge system that it works on today. In addition to this, Steel Peak, Howling Fist, Internal Release, and Purification were also removed as actions. Shoulder Tackle would also instead simply hold 2 charges instead of the elaborate elemental tackle system from Stormblood, and furthermore, also lost its stunning component. Perfect Balance was changed to a 2-minute cooldown again, and Dragon Kick lost its blunt resistance debuff, now instead granting Leaden Fist, massively boosting Boost Shine's potency. Tornado Kick's cooldown was also reduced from 40 seconds to 10 seconds, although while this enabled you to use Tornado Kick in quick succession with the help of Perfect Balance, it wasn't really useful to do so. Riddle of Earth and Riddle of Fire lost their requirement that you needed to be switched to the appropriate fists to function, and Riddle of Fire no longer slowed down your GCD, but otherwise worked just the same. With Shadowbringers, of course, a bunch of new actions were also introduced. Fists of Fire were boosted up to 10% bonus damage, which turned out to become a bit pointless as Fists of Wind got a special trait that allowed the monk to, while using Fists of Wind, to reach a 4th Greased Lightning stack, which gave significantly more damage output. This meant monks would start fights in Fists of Fire, and just 1 GCD before their 4th Greased Lightning stack would appear, switch to Fists of Wind. Deep Meditation was also upgraded to a 70% chance, still lower than the base 80% of Endwalker. And monks also learned Enlightenment as an AoE alternative to Forbidden Chakra. Anatman was introduced as finally an option to hold on to Greased Lightning stacks. As it was channeled for up to 30 seconds, it would add a Greased Lightning stack every 3 seconds and extend the buff duration while in combat. Anatman at this point specifically did not incur the weapon skill GCD, allowing crafty monks to weave it for a moment to sometimes sneak in an extra Greased Lightning stack while building in their openers. Finally, 6-sided Star was added and worked mostly how it does today, trading the speed boost for the ability to extend Greased Lightning. Over the course of Shadowbringers, Form Shift was granted the ability to refresh Greased Lightning if you switch to Opo form with it. This was later changed to doing so after using Form Shift twice, and later still to doing it on every use. This culminated in the Monk rework of patch 5.4, where Greased Lightning was turned into a passive trait, alongside a handful of other changes. The majority of these changes were potency related, however, as the Greased Lightning trait no longer granted the massive damage bonuses. As you no longer needed to use Fists of Wind to get Greased Lightning 4, monks also went back to using Fists of Fire again. Form Shift now granted Formless Fist, acting as all forms at once. Tornado Kick was simply an OGCD attack on a cooldown, and Perfect Balance granted 6 uses on a 15-second duration with a 90-second cooldown. Riddle of Earth instead now functioned as a mini True North with an added damage reduction component, allowing monks to ignore positionals for nearly a minute if they so desired. Brotherhood was also changed to have a lower activation chance, but also affect spells. Anatman was put on the GCD and now instead extended Twin Snakes, making it nigh useless, and 6-sided Star now grants a speed boost when used. Finally, the duration of the forms was increased to 15 seconds. Overall, Monk's playstyle didn't change that much with the rework, although it made them no longer have an awkward 20+ second wind-up after downtime with cutscenes, unless they spent Perfect Balance of course, greatly helping them in all content, especially open world content, where they used to be particularly problematic. Which finally leads us to the end Walker part of this journey. Positionals on all non-finisher moves are removed. Rockbreaker is now a circle AoE instead of a cone, and Meditation is moved to level 15, where Steel Peak is introduced as a low-level version of Forbidden Chakra. Howling Fist is also reintroduced as a low-level Enlightenment. Elixir Field and Tornado Kick are reworked to instead be finisher options for the new Masterful Blitz action that can be used after Perfect Balance, which now has a 40-second cooldown, 2 charges, and only gives 3 uses per cast. Shoulder Tackle is also replaced by Thunderclap, a non-damaging version used for moving quickly around the battlefield. 4-Point Fury now also grants the Twin Snakes buff, renamed to Disciplined Fist rather than just extending it. And Riddle of Earth is now just a defensive cooldown, which at one point very briefly reduced damage on a short stack system cooldown, but then later was turned into a longer cooldown with a healing component. Riddle of Fire was moved to a 60-second cooldown, and Riddle of Wind was introduced as a new 90-second cooldown that makes you auto-attack faster. Brotherhood was instead increased to a 2-minute cooldown, and the duration of the forms were finally further increased to 30 seconds, which incidentally matches with the combo timer for all jobs. In terms of new actions, Arm of the Destroyer upgrades into Shadow of the Destroyer, which instead guarantees critical damage with the Opo form. and Brotherhood guarantees an extra chakra on every action from yourself while it is active. Flint Strike also served as a third option for the Masterful Blitz, later upgraded to Rising Phoenix. Tornado Kick similarly upgraded to Phantom Rush. With the possibility of using Masterful Blitz incorrectly, Celestial Revolution was also introduced as a weaker consolation prize akin to the ninja's Black Mage Bunny. In my opinion, the monk's journey from A Realm Reborn to Endwalker is surprisingly straightforward. Many of its key actions survived, where we can see back in A Realm Reborn, it seemed like one of the key properties of the job was that you needed to keep the form spinning and the greased lightning buff rolling, while also dealing with other things like keeping Touch of Death up, alongside other weapon skills. Over time, the focus was shifted completely to the forms, and then mainly adding buffs to improve this particular concept. With Endwalker, we finally got something new added to that system as well, with the Masterful Blitzes. Some players believe this has simplified the monk, but in my opinion, overall, monk has been quite steady in its style since Stormblood, where the main changes have been that the stress of the greased lightning buffs were removed. Granted, monk was certainly a lot more complex in a different way back in A Realm Reborn and Heavensward. Now, I hope you found this trip through time interesting, nostalgic, or enlightening, but either way, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel, like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, back in Stormblood, a key property of maximizing raid DPS was for tanks to shift out of their tank stances, which reduced their damage output, but increased enmity. This was only possible if everyone used their enmity management tools. Now, given that role actions like Diversion didn't actually make number go bigger, most DPS jobs that had actions like it, meaning everyone, didn't bother using it.